Welcome to Lesson 7 Workbook Exercises, Hebrew 1 and 2, Bright Old Testament 502, 504. In this particular lesson, we've been dealing with pronominal suffixes on nouns and on prepositions. So let's go ahead and look at some practice exercises. The first example exercise that I want to look at is number 3 under section 1 of part 9 of your workbook. The word is people, which in the plural is amim. You notice the dagesh in the mem, which allows us to keep the patak underneath the ayin. The first question that we have here is ka, where we have a kaf and a kametz suffix at the end. This becomes a kaf shva suffix in the second example here, and because of that we have lost the shva, which is underneath the mem in the first example, and instead have replaced it with a seirei in the second example. In both examples, we have the dagesh in the mem to keep the patak underneath the ayin. The question is, what are these particular words saying? I'll give you a second to think about it as you look at the difference between the kaf with the kametz and the kaf with the shva. The first two examples are pretty standard. The fact that both of them have a kaf as the suffix tells us that we are working with the second person. The fact that we have a kaf with a kametz tells us that this is to ms. The kaf with the shva is to fs. Because the kaf with the shva in the second example is the end of the word but doesn't have a vowel in the kaf, as the first example does, we lose the shva under the mem and instead put the seirei. So this is amek, whereas the first one is amka. What about the second two? You'll notice that there is a yod here. So what do we do with this? What are these? These second two examples are, of course, singular suffixes on plural nouns. Peoples. We still have the singular suffix, kaf with a kametz or kaf with a shva, but now the noun is plural, peoples. One of the reasons that I like to cover the construct before I talk about pronominal suffixes is because it gets you used to the idea that when we have a masculine noun connected to another masculine noun, we get seirei yod. I like this just because it triggers in your mind the fact that when you see a yod, it's usually plural. Now, if you look at Van Pelt's grammar, you'll notice type 1 occasionally have a yod, but it is always accompanied by a hirik. A good rule of thumb is whenever you see a yod, you should always look at the previous vowel. If it's anything other than hirik, it is automatically type 2, and on a noun indicates that it is a plural noun. So we have ameka and amayik. The second one here has a patak. The first one has a segol. Neither of those is hirik. There is a hirik under the yod in the second example, but we're talking about the vowel before the yod. Type 2, which is found on plural nouns, will have something prior to the yod that is not a hirik. Segol, patak, seirei, something else. And again, we saw this in the masculine plural construct relationship as well. Even though pronominal suffixes are not necessarily in a construct relationship, it's almost like they are. The peoples of you. And so here we have that yod connection, like a seirei yod, but it's not seirei, it's something else. But it's like it's in construct. It isn't, but it's like it is. So just fix that in your mind. When you see a yod in between the suffix and the noun, 9 times out of 10, the noun's going to be plural. If you look and you see that that vowel that precedes the yod is something other than hirik, then it's definitely going to be plural, at least when we're dealing with nouns. Completely different story when we're dealing with prepositions, which we'll get to in a moment, but for now, recognize that when you see a yod, you should automatically think plural, which should cause you to double check that vowel to see that it's something other than hirik. Here in example number 4 of section 1 of part 9 of your workbook, we have the same situation. In the first two examples, sifram and sifran, we have the suffix, but there is no yod. In the second two, we have hem and hen, but there we have our yod. So the question is, what is the suffix, and then why is there a yod in the second two? I'll give you a second to think about it. The difference between number one and number two, and number three and number four is the plural noun. Number one and number two, it is book. Number three and number four, it is books. Again, we have that yod there. In this case, we have sere yod, which looks just like that masculine plural in the construct relationship. It doesn't mean that we will not have yod in a feminine plural followed by a suffix. We typically have ot, and then we have the yod connected to the suffix. But here, because this is a masculine noun, it just simply is the yod, then the suffix, and it happens to have a sere, although it often will have something else, but not hiric. Hiric yod, especially when it comes to prepositions, shows us that it's singular. Now we're dealing with a plural noun. So this is sif, re, hem. The difference between number one and number two in terms of the suffix is that the hey has dropped off in number one and number two, which it will not do in three and four because of that yod. It has to stick around. So it's as though we have ham and han in number one and number two, but instead with the absence of the hey, it's just am and on. The mem indicates that this is masculine. The nun indicates that it is feminine. Feminine is a good way to remember it. And again, it is plural. So here we have a masculine plural suffix, 3MP, placed onto a singular noun. Then we have a 3FP, a third person feminine plural, placed onto a singular noun. And then it repeats, but with plural nouns. Let's move on to the next one. Number 5 looks pretty tricky. For one thing, we're dealing with a feminine noun here, which is why the plural has the ot, and you can see the ot in number 3 and number 4, which automatically tells us that we're dealing with a plural noun. Number 1 and number 2 are offering. Number 3 and number 4 are going to be offerings. What about those suffixes? This looks pretty tricky. What do you think those are? In number 1, we have min ha ti, which is a 1cs ending with that hiric yod. That's a real giveaway. The fact that we have a tav instead of a hey is because it's like this is acting in the feminine singular construct, where the hey has somewhat hardened to a tav, as it were. The same in the second one, min ha to. This is not min ha ho, but min ha to. Again, we have the vav with the holum, which tells us that this is a 3ms suffix, and the hey has become a tav prior to that vocalic suffix. In number 3 and number 4, we have the ot, although this time we still have a yod on the end. That tells us that we're dealing with 1cs. However, the fact that we have something other than a hiric here is another indication that this is a plural noun. It's not T, it's tai. This is somewhat of a diphthong here. It's almost as though it is AY instead of IY or just Y, the way that we have in the first example. Here in the third, it's a plural noun, and so the vowel changes. It uses the type 2 ending, that vowel other than a hiric. In the fourth example, we see the same presence of a yod, and then we have the vav at the end, which is the 3ms ending. Again, though, we're on a plural noun, which of course we know because of the ot, but again, it will have a yod with something else. Maybe a sere, maybe a patak. It will have a hiric if it's a singular, like in the first example. It will have something other than a hiric in all other types because of the fact that this is a plural noun. So get that in your mind. If you see yod, if it's at the end, look for the vowel. If it's something other than a hiric, it is going to be a plural noun. Yod by itself is 1cs. Yod affixed to something else is simply just the connector to whatever that suffix is, in this case the vav, which is 3ms. One more example that I want to work through here is number 8 in section 1 of part 9 of your exercises. We're looking at the word isha, but in the plural it's irregular. It becomes nashim. So what is this going to look like? Well, as you look at the nouns themselves, you can see how isha has become nashim in number 3 and number 4. Nashai and nashenu. Number 1 and number 2, it's ishti and ishto. So isha, has become nashim in number 3 and number 4, but with slight changes. So look at the suffix and determine what are the suffixes that have been placed onto these nouns. Well, actually, we're dealing with the same type of suffixes that we dealt in the previous example. 1CS and 3MS, at least in number 1 and number 2. The T and the toe. The Hirik Yod is 1CS, the Holam Vav is 3MS. The question, though, has to do with Nashai. What exactly is this ending? Well, the Yod tells us that we're dealing with a 1CS. However, again, we're dealing with Nashim, which is the plural. Instead, almost as though it was in the construct, the Hirik Yod Mem has dropped and has been replaced by a Yod, not Seire, but something other than Hirik. Here we have the Patak. So this is Nashai, which is wives. Again, it's irregular. What about number 4, though? We have Nashenu. Here we don't have E or to. Instead, we have nu, as in anachnu. This is 1CP. Now we're again looking at the root and we see nashe, which looks a whole lot like the construct of the masculine plural, although we're not dealing with masculine plural here because this is wives. But again, nashim is very irregular and behaves somewhat like masculine plural. But what's important is that we have a yod and something other than hirik because it's a plural noun. Here we have a seire. So nashenu is our wives. 1CP. Hopefully that makes sense to you. Again, the difference between a singular noun and a plural noun, and the presence of the yod is important, but what's really important is that vowel that comes before the yod. Let's move on to section 2 of the exercises here in part 9. Now we're looking at the way that suffixes are affixed to prepositions. This is pretty straightforward, just simply fixing a suffix onto a preposition, but I want to look specifically at number 9 because this one is irregular. Memeni. What exactly is going on here? Look at the suffix and try to figure out what the root is. What preposition is this being used? You might be tempted to think as you look at the ending of memeni that this is a 1CP, but that would be new, and this is ni, hirik yod, a 1CS ending. The real question is, what is the preposition? Well, the preposition is the preposition min, which means from. Certain prepositions, and min is one of them, when they receive a object as a pronominal suffix from me, duplicate themselves. So it's as though this is min, e, where we have the dagesh in the mem to represent the nun that's with the first mem. Why it does this is just a quirk of the language, probably to differentiate it from words that might look similar, but here we have memeni from min with a 1CS object. What about these next two? We have elayic and we have elai. This is taking a type 2 ending. Remember, this is a preposition, so it's not saying that this is a plural noun. That would be el, not ale. El would be God, so it would be gods. This is ale, which is the preposition to or toward. But what about the suffix that is affixed? Why do we see it the way that we see it? Think about it for a moment. The kaf in number 12 is an immediate giveaway that we're dealing with second person. The shva in the kaf is an immediate giveaway that we're dealing with feminine. So this is to fs, because there is no nun after the kaf. The kaf is the final letter. The fact that we have a patak and a yod and a hirik is just one of the quirks of this preposition, taking type 2 endings. I think one of the reasons that Van Pelt calls them type 1 and type 2 rather than singular noun, plural noun is that this is not a noun. This is a preposition. The noun is el, meaning God or gods, and is a segol. This is a sere, ale, which is a preposition, to or toward. In number 13, we see the yod again, which immediately tells us that this is a 1cs object, a pronominal suffix placed onto ale. The fact that we have a patak with the yod means nothing, because again, this is not a noun, so it's not plural. It's just simply a preposition, to me. Ale takes type 2 endings, and I think the reason that type 2 is what Van Pelt calls it instead of plural is because prepositions and nouns share these objects and share the relationship between the particular word and the object using the yod and the other vowels. It's not plural because it's a preposition. Again, though, it is possible to have a plural in the sense that the suffix is plural. But because this is a preposition and not a noun, the preposition itself is singular. It's not going to be to's you or to's me. It's to you, to me, to us, to him, to them. The suffix may be plural, but the preposition will just be the preposition. Well, that brings us to the end of another set of exercises. Now that we've done some examples, go and do the rest of the examples in your workbook.